The morning sun cast long shadows across Pine Oak Street as Martha Washington, a 68-year-old grandmother, carefully tended to her beloved rose garden. Her gentle hands, weathered by time but still graceful, moved skillfully between the thorny stems. The front yard of her two-story colonial home, which she had owned for over 3 decades, was her pride and joy. Every neighbor knew Martha for her award-winning roses and her kind smile. That peaceful Thursday morning seemed no different from any other until Officer James Miller's patrol car slowly rolled down the street. He was new to the force, just 3 years in, and carried himself with the kind of authority that made people nervous rather than safe. His sunglasses hid his eyes as he watched Martha working in her garden, her gray hair neatly tied back with a floral scarf. The patrol car's tires crunched on the gravel as Officer Miller pulled up to the curb. Martha didn't notice him at first, too focused on pruning a particularly stubborn branch. The car door opened with a sharp click, and heavy boots stepped onto the pavement. "Ma'am," Officer Miller called out, his hand resting casually on his belt near his holster. "What are you doing at this property?" Martha looked up, surprised by the question, but not entirely unfamiliar with such situations. She straightened up slowly, her knees protesting after kneeling for so long. "Good morning, officer. I'm just tending to my roses. Is there something wrong?" Officer Miller took 3 steps forward, his boots leaving marks on the dewy grass. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this neighborhood. I'm going to need to see some identification." Mrs. Sarah Chen, Martha's neighbor of 15 years, was watering her own plants next door and stopped to watch the scene unfold. She knew something wasn't right. Martha Washington was as much a part of Pine Oak Street as the old oak trees that lined it. "Officer, I live here," Martha explained calmly, though her heart had begun to race. She taught elementary school for 40 years and knew how to keep her voice steady even when she was worried. "This is my home." "Ma'am, in this neighborhood?" Officer Miller's tone carried a weight of disbelief that made Martha's stomach tighten. "I'm going to need to see some proof of residence and identification. Now." Martha's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her phone in her gardening apron pocket. With movements that appeared calm but felt mechanical, she pressed the record button, a habit her son Marcus had insisted she develop. "Of course, officer. My ID is inside. Would you like to follow me to the door?" "No, ma'am." "You stay right there where I can see you. Are you saying you have no identification on you while wandering around this property?" By now, several other neighbors had noticed the confrontation. Tom Baker, a retired judge who lived across the street, had stepped onto his porch. Jessica Rodriguez from 2 doors down had stopped her morning jog to watch. "I'm not wandering, officer," Martha replied, her dignity intact despite the growing humiliation. "As I said, this is my home. I've lived here for 32 years. If you'll allow me to go inside." "Turn around and place your hands where I can see them," Officer Miller interrupted, his voice growing harder. "You're being evasive." Martha's heart pounded, but years of facing prejudice had taught her to remain composed. She kept her phone recording as she carefully turned around, her gardening gloves still on her hands, dirt from her beloved roses still under her fingernails. Mrs. Chen had pulled out her own phone and was recording too. "This is ridiculous," she called out. "That's Martha Washington. She's lived here longer than most of us." "Ma'am, stay back or you'll be interfering with police business," Officer Miller snapped, not taking his eyes off Martha. What Officer Miller couldn't know, was that Martha's son Marcus wasn't just any concerned citizen. Captain Marcus Washington headed the Internal Affairs Division in the neighboring city's police department. The same Marcus Washington who had earned a reputation for being tough but fair when handling police misconduct cases. The same Marcus whose photo with the police commissioner sat proudly on Martha's mantel, right next to her late husband's police badge. As Officer Miller reached for his handcuffs, Martha closed her eyes and said a quiet prayer, not for herself, but for the young officer who had no idea what chain of events he was about to set in motion. Mrs. Chen couldn't stay quiet any longer. She hurried toward her fence, her watering can forgotten on her lawn. "Officer, please, I can vouch for Martha. She's my neighbor of 15 years. Officer Miller turned his head sharply. "Step back, ma'am. This is your final warning." Martha felt the cool metal of handcuffs touch her wrist. The roses she had been tending now witnessed her humiliation, their sweet scent mixing with the morning air. Her phone was still recording in her apron pocket, capturing every word, every sound. "Officer Miller," Martha said, reading his nameplate, her voice carrying the same tone she had used with troubled students during her teaching days. "I understand you're doing your job, but I can prove this is my home. My ID is inside, and I have bills, photos, everything to show you." More neighbors gathered on their porches and lawns. Tom Baker, the retired judge, walked down his driveway with the assistance of his cane. "Young man," he called out, his judicial authority still present in his voice, "I've known Martha Washington for 3 decades. This is absolutely unnecessary." Officer Miller's grip on the handcuffs tightened. "Everyone needs to back away now. This is a police matter." Just then, Martha's grandson Kevin's school bus drove by. The 12-year-old boy pressed his face against the window, eyes wide with fear as he saw his grandmother with her hands behind her back. The bus driver, Miss Patterson, who knew Martha from countless morning greetings, immediately pulled over. "Keep the handcuffs off," Martha said quietly but firmly. "My grandson just saw this. He's scared enough already." Her words carried the weight of a mother's concern, not for herself but for a child's innocence being shattered. Officer Miller hesitated, the mention of the watching child making him pause. In that moment, Martha's phone rang in her apron pocket, its distinctive ringtone telling her it was Marcus calling. "That's my phone ringing," Martha said. "May I answer it? It's my son." Slowly, Officer Miller commanded, his earlier confidence wavering as more witnesses gathered. No sudden movements. With deliberate care, Martha reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. The screen showed Marcus, Captain, with a photo of her son in his police uniform. She held it up so Officer Miller could see. "It's my son," she repeated. "He's probably calling because Kevin just texted him about what he saw from the bus." Officer Miller stared at the phone screen, his face changing as he processed what he was seeing. The man in the uniform photo wore captain's bars and looked directly into the camera with authority that matched his rank. Before Martha could answer, another police car pulled up to the scene. Officer Rodriguez, a veteran officer who had patrolled this neighborhood for years, stepped out quickly. "Miller," she called out. "Stand down immediately." Officer Miller's hand dropped from the handcuffs. Officer Rodriguez approached rapidly, her face showing a mix of concern and professional embarrassment. "Mrs. Washington," Officer Rodriguez said, "I came as soon as Mrs. Chen called the station. Are you all right?" Martha straightened her back, dignity intact. "Yes, Sandra, I'm fine. Though I believe we'll need to have a community meeting about proper police procedures in our neighborhood." Officer Rodriguez turned to Miller, her voice low but sharp. "That woman you were about to handcuff, she served on our community police advisory board for 10 years. Her late husband was Sergeant Washington, who died in the line of duty, and her son is Captain Marcus Washington of Internal Affairs." The color drained from Officer Miller's face. The phone in Martha's hand was still ringing. "You should answer that, Mrs. Washington," Officer Rodriguez suggested. "The captain will want to know what's happening." Martha finally accepted the call, her voice calm despite everything. "Hello, Marcus. Yes, I'm okay. There's been a misunderstanding at the house. Officer Rodriguez is here now." She paused, listening. "No, son, don't leave your meeting. We're going to handle this the right way." As Martha spoke with her son, the gathering of neighbors stood witness to a powerful moment, not of revenge or anger, but of dignity in the face of injustice. Officer Miller stood rooted to the spot, realizing that his morning of enforcing the law had turned into a harsh lesson about wielding power without wisdom. Within 30 minutes of Martha's call with Marcus, the quiet street had transformed into a hub of activity. Police Chief David Thompson himself pulled up in his unmarked car, his presence showing just how quickly word had traveled through the department. The morning sun now beat down strongly on the gathering crowd, but nobody moved from their spots. Martha sat on her porch swing, surrounded by concerned neighbors. Mrs. Chen had brought over a glass of cold lemonade, while Tom Baker shared quiet words of legal advice. Officer Miller stood awkwardly by his patrol car, under the watchful eye of Officer Rodriguez. "Mrs. Washington," Chief Thompson said, climbing the porch steps, "I came as soon as I heard. I'm deeply sorry for this incident." Martha looked up at the chief, her hands folded calmly in her lap. David, I've known you since you were a rookie partner to my late husband. This isn't just about me. This is about every person who doesn't have a police captain for a son. The chief nodded gravely. He'd attended backyard barbecues at this very house, watched Marcus grow from a determined young officer to a respected captain. You're absolutely right, Martha, and that's exactly why we need to handle this properly. Kevin's school bus returned, dropping him off early after the principal heard what happened. The young boy ran straight to his grandmother, tears in his eyes. "Grandma, are you okay? I saw that officer. I was so scared." Martha hugged her grandson tight, her composure cracking slightly for the first time that morning. "I'm fine, baby. Everything's going to be okay. Sometimes hard things happen so we can make things better for others." Meanwhile, phones have been busy throughout the neighborhood. Local community leaders were arriving. Pastor Johnson from the First Baptist Church, Dr. Patricia Lee from the Civil Rights Coalition, and City Council member Robert Torres. This wasn't just a neighborhood incident anymore. It was becoming a moment for change. Officer Miller watched as more people arrived, the weight of his actions growing heavier by the minute. Officer Rodriguez approached him, her voice low but firm. "The captain is on his way. He's cut his meeting short." Miller swallowed hard. "I was just following protocol for suspicious persons." "No," Rodriguez cut him off. "You were profiling an elderly woman in her own garden. There was no suspicious activity, just your suspicious mind." The neighborhood kids were coming home from school now, many stopping to watch the scene unfold. These were children Martha had tutored in mathematics, children who brought her cookies during holidays, children who knew her garden as a safe place to learn about flowers and life. Sarah Chen stood up suddenly, addressing the growing crowd. "We need to do more than just handle this one incident. This has to be a wake-up call. How many times has this happened to people who don't have our Martha's connections?" Pastor Johnson nodded in agreement. "Martha's always said we need more community policing programs. Maybe this is the push we needed." A sleek black SUV turned onto Pine Oak Street, and everyone knew who it was. Captain Marcus Washington had arrived. He stepped out of his vehicle, impressive in his full uniform, his face a mask of professional calm that barely concealed his personal anger. Officer Miller straightened up instinctively at the sight of the captain's bars. Marcus walked past him without a glance, heading straight for his mother. The crowd parted silently. "Mama," he said softly, embracing her. Then he turned to his nephew. "Kevin, thank you for being brave and telling me what happened." Martha touched her son's arm. "Marcus, we need to use this moment, not for punishment, but for change." The captain looked at his mother with understanding. This was why she was respected throughout the community, her ability to turn painful moments into opportunities for growth. Chief Thompson stepped forward. "Captain, I think your mother's right. We need to address this systemically." Marcus nodded, finally turning to face Officer Miller. "Officer, my mother was humiliated in her own garden today. But more importantly, you showed us exactly why we need major reforms in this department. Starting tomorrow, you'll be part of those reforms, one way or another." The gathered crowd murmured in agreement. Martha Washington's garden had become more than just a crime scene. It had become ground zero for a community demanding change, led by a remarkable woman who chose wisdom over anger and progress over punishment. The next morning, Captain Marcus Washington sat in his office at the Internal Affairs Division, reviewing the videos from the incident. His mother's phone recording played on one screen, while neighborhood security footage rolled on another. Each viewing made his jaw tighten, but he maintained his professional composure. Lisa Chen, his trusted sergeant, knocked on his door. "Captain, Officer Miller's complete service record is here, and sir, there's something you need to see." Marcus looked up from the screens. "What did you find?" 6 complaints in 3 years, all from minority residents. Each was dismissed due to lack of evidence or witnesses. Lisa placed the thick folder on his desk. "But this time, we have multiple videos, respected witnesses, and it happened to my mother," Marcus finished, his voice steady but heavy with meaning. He opened the folder, scanning the previous complaints. Each told a similar story: aggressive questioning, excessive force, and dismissive behavior toward minority citizens. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Kevin. "Grandma is making her special apple pie. She says it helps her think better about important things." Marcus smiled despite the situation. His mother's apple pie had been present at every major family discussion, every decision point. He texted back, "Save me a piece. I'll be there for dinner." Turning back to Lisa, he straightened in his chair. "Get me Officer Rodriguez's statement. She was first on scene after the initial incident. And contact Dr. Lee from the Civil Rights Coalition. My mother mentioned she has statistics on similar incidents in our district." As Lisa left, Marcus's office phone rang. It was Chief Thompson. "Captain," the chief began, "the mayor's office is involved now. This could be big, bigger than just one incident." "It needs to be bigger," Marcus replied. "My mother. She said something yesterday that stuck with me. She said we need to think about all the people who don't have a police captain for a son." "She's right," Thompson agreed. "The press is asking questions. Community leaders are demanding action. What's your recommendation?" Marcus looked at the photo on his desk, his father in uniform, standing proud at his police academy graduation 25 years ago. "We need comprehensive reform, Chief. Not just sensitivity training. Real, structural change." Meanwhile, across town, Martha sat at her kitchen table with Kevin, rolling dough for her apple pie. The boy watched his grandmother's steady hands, the same hands that had been almost handcuffed yesterday. "Grandma," Kevin asked, sprinkling flour on the counter, "are you mad at that officer?" Martha paused her rolling pin. "No, baby, I'm disappointed in the system that made him think what he did was okay. Being mad doesn't fix things. Making changes fixes things." Her phone rang. It was Sarah Chen. "Martha, turn on the news. They're talking about what happened." Martha reached for the remote, turning on her small kitchen TV. The local news was showing the video of the incident, followed by interviews with neighbors. The headline read, "Community demands police reform after respected elder targeted." Kevin watched the screen, then looked at his grandmother. "You're famous now." "No, sweetheart," Martha corrected gently. "The problem is famous now, and that's what needs to happen for things to change." Back at the station, Marcus was preparing for a press conference. Lisa rushed in with more files. "Captain, we found similar patterns in other precincts. It's not just Officer Miller. The data shows a clear trend of systemic issues," Marcus finished. "Mother said this wasn't about one officer or one incident." He stood up, straightening his uniform. "What time is the community meeting tonight?" 7 p.m. at First Baptist. Your mother insisted on bringing her apple pie." Marcus smiled again. His mother understood something many missed, that real change happened when people came together, broke bread, and talked honestly about hard things. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Kevin. "Grandma says to remember what Grandpa always said. The badge doesn't make the officer, the heart does." Marcus touched the captain's bars on his collar, thinking of his father's words. Today, they would start making real changes, not just because his mother was wronged, but because every citizen deserved better. The incident in Martha's garden was about to bloom into something much more significant than roses. The First Baptist Church was packed that evening, with people spilling out onto the steps. Inside, tables lined the walls with homemade food, including Martha's famous apple pie. The community had transformed a police misconduct meeting into something that felt more like a town hall for change. Officer Miller sat in the front row, his uniform crisp but his shoulders tense. He'd been ordered to attend by Chief Thompson, though the chief's words were, "Listen and learn, don't defend yourself tonight." Martha stood at the podium, her gray hair neatly styled, wearing a purple dress that Kevin had once said made her look like a queen. The room fell silent as she began to speak. "Yesterday, I was gardening in my front yard," she started, her voice clear and strong. "Today, we're all here because what happened to me happens too often to too many. But this isn't about punishment. This is about growth." In the back of the room, Marcus watched his mother with pride. Lisa leaned over and whispered, "Now I see where you got your leadership skills from." Dr. Patricia Lee presented the statistics next. "In the past 5 years, our district has seen over 200 similar incidents. Most went unreported because people were afraid or felt nothing would change." She clicked to the next slide. "But today, we have a chance to change that." Officer Rodriguez stepped up to share her perspective. "As officers, we're trained to protect and serve. But somewhere along the way, some of us forgot who we're protecting and serving. She looked directly at Officer Miller. We became warriors in our minds when we should have remained guardians. Kevin sat between his grandmother and Sarah Chen, taking notes in his school notebook. For my social studies project, he explained to anyone who asked. We're supposed to write about community leadership. Chief Thompson presented the department's initial reform proposals. Mandatory community integration hours for all officers. A civilian review board with real power. New training protocols developed with community input. Regular neighborhood meetings between officers and residents. Body camera footage review by civilian committee. But it was Martha who proposed the most surprising initiative. She stood again, moving slowly to the podium. I've been thinking about Officer Miller, she said, causing the young officer to look up sharply. And I'd like to invite him to help me teach a weekly class at the community center. We'll call it Building Bridges. Officers and residents, learning about each other's lives, sharing stories and concerns. A murmur went through the crowd. Officer Miller's face showed surprise, then confusion, then something that looked like hope. Marcus stepped forward. Internal Affairs will oversee these reforms, but we won't run them. The community will, because that's who we serve. He looked at his mother. Someone wise once told me that real change starts in gardens and kitchens, not just in offices. Pastor Johnson raised his hand. The church will host monthly dinners. Officers and families, breaking bread together. No uniforms, no badges, just people. Sarah Chen stood up next. And my real estate office will sponsor cultural awareness events. Our officers need to know the communities they serve. As the meeting continued, Kevin tugged at his grandmother's sleeve. Grandma, can I help with your garden class too? Martha smiled, touching his cheek gently. Of course, baby. Gardens are good places for new beginnings. Officer Miller finally stood up, his voice shaky but determined. Mrs. Washington, I would be honored to learn from you, and I have a lot to learn. The room grew quiet, watching this moment unfold. Martha nodded, her eyes kind but serious. Then we'll start next week. Bring work gloves. Those roses don't tend themselves. As the meeting wrapped up, people lingered over coffee and pie, sharing stories and ideas. Officer Rodriguez watched Officer Miller help Martha pack up her pie containers, noting how he handled them with the same care he lacked yesterday. Marcus found his mother in the crowd. You're turning this into something beautiful, Mama. Martha patted his cheek, just as she had done with Kevin. Baby, sometimes the ugliest moments can grow into the most beautiful changes, just like how my best roses often come from the thornier bushes. The church slowly emptied, but the energy of change remained. Tomorrow, new policies would begin. Next week, classes would start. And in Martha's garden, new seeds of understanding would be planted, tended by unlikely partners in the pursuit of justice. 2 weeks after the incident, Officer Miller stood in Martha's garden, wearing jeans and a t-shirt instead of his uniform. The morning sun was gentle, and a group of community members gathered around as Martha demonstrated proper rose pruning techniques. You see, Martha explained, her experienced hands working with the shears, sometimes cutting back is necessary for new growth. Just like in life, we have to remove what's damaged to let the healthy parts flourish. Miller watched intently, noticing how different Martha looked here, confident, peaceful, completely in her element. Kevin sat cross-legged nearby, taking pictures for the community newsletter he'd started with his friends. Officer Miller, Martha called, would you like to try? He stepped forward nervously, accepting the gardening shears. His hands, used to handling handcuffs and weapons, felt clumsy with these gentler tools. Careful now, Martha guided, standing beside him. See that dead branch? Cut it at a 45-degree angle, just above the healthy bud. As Miller made the cut, Sarah Chen recorded the moment on her phone. Not for evidence this time, but for the community's Building Bridges program documentation. The video would later be shown at the police academy as part of their new training curriculum. Look, Grandma. Kevin called out. The rosebud you showed me last week is opening. The small group gathered around the blooming flower. Among them was Officer Rodriguez, who now regularly attended these garden sessions on her off days. She brought her teenage daughter along this time. Mrs. Washington, Miller spoke up, his voice carrying a weight of realization. I never really understood what community policing meant until now. I thought it was just about patrolling neighborhoods, but it's about this, knowing people, their stories, their gardens. Martha nodded, adjusting her gardening hat. Life has a way of teaching us, doesn't it? Sometimes through thorns, sometimes through roses. Just then, Captain Marcus arrived with Chief Thompson. They were there to document the success of the garden program, but both men found themselves drawn into the actual gardening lesson. "Mom," Marcus called out, "is this the rose bush Dad planted?" "The very same," Martha replied, touching the sturdy old plant. 25 years old and still blooming. Your father always said good things take time and care to grow." Chief Thompson picked up a watering can, surprising everyone by knowing exactly how to water the roses without damaging the blooms. "My grandmother taught me," he explained with a smile. The morning's lesson shifted to the community center next door, where tables were set up for their weekly discussion group. Today's topic was understanding our shared spaces. Officer Miller raised his hand during the discussion. "I want to share something," he said, standing up. "When I first joined the force, I thought power came from authority. But these past 2 weeks in Mrs. Washington's garden have taught me that real power comes from understanding and respect." Martha watched him from her seat, noting how different he looked from that first morning, more humble, more human. Kevin had drawn a cartoon for the newsletter showing Officer Miller's transformation from a stern-faced policeman to a gardener with a smile, titled "Growth Takes Time." Dr. Lee, who'd been documenting the program's progress, spoke up. "The incident reports in our district have dropped by 30% since we started these community sessions. People are talking to each other instead of calling 911 for every concern." As the meeting continued, Martha's phone buzzed with a message. It was from the mayor's office. Other districts wanted to start similar programs. Her little garden was sprouting changes across the city. "You know," Officer Rodriguez said during the break, "my daughter asked me this morning if she could join the Junior Police Academy. She said seeing these changes made her believe she could make a difference too." Martha looked around the room, at Miller learning to be a better officer, at Kevin learning to be a community leader, at officers and residents sharing coffee and stories. The thorns of that difficult morning had indeed produced something beautiful. "Next week," she announced, "we'll plant new roses together. Because every garden, like every community, needs both old wisdom and new beginnings to thrive." 1 month after the garden program began, Martha Washington stood before the city council. The chambers were packed with familiar faces, officers, neighbors, community leaders, and most importantly, those who had previously felt voiceless in discussions about police reform. Kevin sat in the front row, still taking notes in his notebook, now nearly full with observations about community change. Officer Miller sat beside him, no longer the same man who had almost arrested Martha in her garden. His badge now shone with a different kind of authority, one earned through understanding and respect. "Members of the council," Martha began, her voice steady and clear, "what started in my garden has grown into something remarkable. But we're here today because there's more work to be done." She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, showing pictures of the garden classes, community meetings, and police-resident dialogue sessions. Dr. Lee stood beside her, ready with the statistics. "In just 1 month," Dr. Lee reported, "complaints against officers have decreased by 40%. Community tip reporting has increased by 60%, but the most significant change isn't in the numbers, it's in the stories." Officer Rodriguez stepped forward to share her experience. "Last week, I responded to a call about teenagers in the park after hours. Instead of immediately confronting them, I remembered Mrs. Washington's words about growth and understanding. I discovered they were studying for exams because some didn't have quiet spaces at home. Now we're working to keep the community center open later for students." Marcus watched from his seat, pride evident in his eyes. His mother had turned a moment of potential tragedy into a movement for change. Internal Affairs was receiving requests from other districts, asking how to implement similar programs. Sarah Chen presented next, showing photographs of the transformation. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a picture of Officer Miller teaching a group of kids about police equipment while they taught him about their cultural traditions. "This is what real community policing looks like." The mayor leaned forward, clearly impressed. "Mrs. Washington, what do you need from the city council to expand this program?" Martha smiled, prepared for this question. "We need funding for 10 more community gardens across the city. Each one will be a training ground for officers and a gathering place for residents. We need support for extended community center hours, and most importantly, we need your commitment to continue backing these reforms. Chief Thompson stood up. The police department fully supports this request. We're already seeing results in officer morale and community trust. Kevin raised his hand, surprising everyone. Can I say something? The council president nodded, and Kevin walked to the podium, standing next to his grandmother. My social studies teacher asked us what makes a community strong. I wrote about my grandma's garden. It's not just about flowers, it's about growing trust. Like she always says, even the strongest roses need support to climb. The chamber filled with warm applause. Officer Miller wiped a tear from his eye, remembering how differently things could have turned out that morning in Martha's garden. The council voted unanimously to approve the funding. As people celebrated outside the chambers, Martha found herself surrounded by reporters. "Mrs. Washington, did you ever expect your garden to create such change?" She thought for a moment before answering. "My late husband used to say that the best gardens grow more than just flowers. They grow understanding, patience, and community. What happened to me was unfortunate, but what grew from it is extraordinary." Officer Miller approached her, now comfortable in her presence. "Mrs. Washington, the new recruits at the academy asked if you would speak at their graduation next month. They say you're teaching them more about being good officers than any manual could." Martha touched his arm gently. "We'll all speak together, you, me, and Kevin. Show them how change looks from every side." As they left City Hall, Marcus overheard two council members talking. "That woman turned a garden into a movement," one said. "And she did it with kindness instead of anger." The evening news would show clips of the council meeting, but the real story was in the small moments. Officer Miller helping Kevin with his homework at the community center, Officer Rodriguez organizing late-night study sessions for teenagers, and Martha, still tending her roses every morning, now surrounded by a community learning to grow together. 6 months after the incident in Martha's garden, Pine Oak Street hosted a special celebration. The entire block was filled with tables, chairs, and the delicious smell of a community potluck. Strings of lights hung between the trees, and in the center of it all was Martha's garden, now twice its original size. "Look, Grandma," Kevin called out, pointing to the newspaper he held. The headline read, "Garden of Change: How One Woman's Experience Transformed Police-Community Relations." Below was a photo of Martha and Officer Miller together, teaching a group of new police recruits about community engagement. The celebration wasn't just about Martha's garden anymore. It was about the 9 new community gardens that had sprouted across the city, each one a center for police-community relationships. Officer Miller, now promoted to Community Relations Sergeant, stood grilling hamburgers and telling stories to a group of children. "Who would have thought?" Sarah Chen said, helping Martha arrange pies on a long table. "That morning would lead to all this." Captain Marcus walked through the crowd, stopping to chat with residents and officers alike. He no longer needed to wear his uniform at these gatherings. Everyone knew who he was, not just as a police captain, but as Martha's son, as part of this community. "Mom," he called out. "The governor's office called again. They want to implement your program statewide." Martha adjusted her favorite purple apron, smiling. "Tell them what I always say, change grows from the ground up, not from the top down. They'll need to start with their own community gardens." Officer Rodriguez, now heading the police training program, brought over her latest statistics. Complaints down 70%, community engagement up 80%, and look at this, applications for the police academy have doubled. People want to be part of the change. Kevin had set up a display of his photographs, documenting the 6-month journey. One showed Officer Miller's first attempt at pruning roses. Another captured the moment the first new community garden broke ground. There was Martha speaking at the police academy, and officers playing basketball with neighborhood kids. "Mrs. Washington," Officer Miller approached, looking nervous but determined. "I have something to show you." He led Martha to a small table where his young daughter sat drawing. The picture showed a police officer and an elderly woman tending a garden together, with the words, "Heroes come in many forms," written in crayon. She drew this for her school project about community heroes, Miller explained, his voice thick with emotion. "She chose you. The evening grew cooler, but nobody wanted to leave. Chief Thompson stood to make a speech, but found himself choked up. Instead, he simply raised his glass. To Martha Washington, who taught us that the best way to handle injustice is to grow justice. Dr. Lee shared the latest research results. The Garden Initiative, as it was now known, had been featured in national police training journals. Cities across the country were requesting information about starting their own programs. As the celebration continued, Martha sat in her porch swing, watching her community, officers and residents, young and old, all colors and backgrounds, sharing food, stories, and laughter together. Kevin joined her, resting his head on her shoulder. "Grandma," he said, "remember when you told me that sometimes hard things happen so we can make things better for others?" Martha nodded, patting his hand. "Well, I think you make things better for everybody." Officer Miller approached the porch, carrying a small potted rosebush. "Mrs. Washington, we all pitched in to get this. It's a new variety they've named Washington's Wisdom. The grower says it's especially good at bringing people together." Martha touched the delicate pink buds, tears in her eyes. Behind her, the wall of her house now displayed dozens of photos, training sessions, community meetings, garden classes, and countless moments of connection and understanding. The night ended with Martha back in her garden, showing the group of young officers and residents how to plant the new rose bush. "Remember," she said, her voice carrying the weight of wisdom and hope, "a garden needs 3 things to thrive: good soil, regular care, and most importantly, people who believe in its growth." As the last guests left, Marcus hugged his mother. "You did it, Mama. You really did it." Martha looked at her garden, now a symbol of change across the city. "No, son," she corrected gently, "we all did it. Every single person who chose to believe that something beautiful could grow from that difficult morning. That's the real miracle of any garden. It takes everyone's hands to make it bloom."